Real exciting time, and I can remember my parents just getting very excited about it, and we would watch the TV, and I was always fascinated with space, kind of like the children looking at Superman and hoping that they could fly.
You're not afraid at all?
No, I'm not. When I was watching the movie A Dream is Alive, which is about the shuttle, and we were watching the shuttle take off, and we were getting all excited. About the last thing that I really thought about was the safety of it. It's a safe program. Probably one of the good examples of that was at the last countdown, the computer shut down at 3 seconds because one of the secondary systems wasn't working, one of the backup systems.
Now, as you were watching that, did you have sweaty palms? Thinking about
it was so exciting to be in mission control. It was wonderful.
Why you? I mean, 11,000 applicants. What do you think it is about you that stood out in their minds?
That is probably one of the most difficult questions that I've been asked, because I was down there with 9 other very excited, very enthusiastic teachers, good communicators, love their profession, and I was really thinking that NASA was going to have to put all our names in a hat and just pull one.
Now, you all had to design a project, I think,
yes,
that you will complete aboard the shuttle. What was your project and why?
Well, the project that I designed was to keep a journal or a diary on board the shuttle. The reason I picked it out was I'm not a science person. I teach social studies, so I didn't want to get into the science or math area. I wanted to do something that I was comfortable with. But I also wanted to kind of give students that link with the ordinary person as a part of history, and I felt through the diary I could do that.
You've had to get used to this incredible amount of media attention. I mean, you go from being a school teacher to being a national figure. How are you dealing with that? How is that?
Well, right now it's a lot of fun. It's really helping me link up with my students because I don't see them right now. School's not in session. So this is my chance to tell them what I've been doing through the newspapers and through television, and I hope that they're able to get a piece of what's been happening. I'd love to go into the classroom right now and say, hey kids, guess what I've been doing the last 2 weeks?
And the family's okay with this? You have a 5- and a 9-year-old.
They're really excited.
Are they?
Scott understands. He's 9 years old, and he's really excited about it. He sees kind of the historical importance of it. Caroline's a little concerned that Mommy's going to be away for a while, but I'm sure she'll be fine. Dad would love to be in my shoes right now. He really would.
Christa McAuliffe, she had a dream, and she followed it to the end, and her husband, Stephen, and her children, Scott and Caroline, should be very proud. We'll be back.
And represents the Florida district that includes the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral. He's also the chairman of the House subcommittee that's responsible for NASA's funding and operation. And earlier this month, he became the 2nd member of Congress to fly in a shuttle. I spoke with him just a few minutes ago this morning. I started by asking him how, if at all, yesterday's tragedy has caused him to think any differently about the shuttle program.
It hasn't caused me to conclude any differently about America's shuttle. We'll find the problem, we'll fix it, and we'll go on. America needs her capability of getting into space. We've got to have assured access to space.
In your capacity overseeing for your subcommittee the NASA budget, how might this disaster affect the public perception and therefore have an effect on the budget for the program you're talking about?
There's always a possibility, David, but I don't think it's going to happen. During national tragedy, the people come together. And I think that's what's happening right now all over this nation. I think the people also recognize the necessity of a vigorous American space program. And although there will be the short-term effects of the delayed launches, we had an ambitious schedule this year. There will be the calls for cuts in the space program, but those won't prevail in the halls of Congress.
No, we're striking out here too in audio. I think maybe we should just try to produce Father Moroka, a neighbor and a family friend of Christa McAuliffe. Father Chester Moroka, what I was asking was, when your parishioners come to you for the answer to the question, why does such a thing happen to such a good person as Christa, what do you say?
Well, we don't have an answer for that, Jane. We simply try to be supportive. As we mentioned last night at our service, we simply see the value of her work, of her contribution to this program, and the example that she's been to the nation, especially to the young people. Other than that, we simply try to be supportive.
Ginny Timmons, you're the next door neighbor. You have 8 children, I understand. One of your daughters has an autographed picture of Krista. What did Krista say in that autograph?
Well, I brought the picture with me, Jane, just because the picture bespeaks Krista's charisma that all of us felt. Our daughter is a freshman and received this as a high schooler, but I think any of us on reading it could identify as well.
And what does she say?
In it, she speaks of, to Jean, may your future be limited only by your dreams. Love, Krista.
Well, what about the dreams of a young woman? Are they going to be traumatized by the loss?
I'm sure for everyone, they're devastated, but it's a temporary devastation. I think all of us, as I say, I readily identify not only with what has happened to Krista, but to her families and the other astronauts and their families.
Pam, you have known Krista for a long time as a dear family friend. We know, obviously, she was a devoted teacher, a modern working mother, but she was more than that to her family, obviously. How did she do it all, in the phrase of the day?
She had lots of energy, and what you saw on television through the media is how she acted all the time. She was an excellent mother. She spent lots of time with her children, taking them all over the place, doing the things that all the mothers do. It was hard for her, I think, to leave her children and go back to school, but she was so dedicated about teaching that she was able to combine the two, and she had lots of support from her husband, Steve, and from the people around her, and she was able to carry it off.
Ginny, everybody's so concerned about Steve and the little kids. You watched them next door the last 4 months without Mom. They doing okay?
Right. Well, I think one of the nice things, Mrs. Pauley, is that Steve is such a loving person, and he readily took on the role of both parents when Krista left.
With our assessment of the Challenger tragedy, we'll be going to Washington to talk to Senator Jake Garn. He has flown a space shuttle mission, and among those who died were men and women he counts as personal friends. We'll also talk to Senator Pete Domenici, a member of the subcommittee that appropriates funds for the space program.
And we'll also hear from 2 former astronauts who themselves experienced frightening emergencies in outer space, David Scott and Alan Bean. Bean, by the way, also was involved in the training of 5 of those who were lost aboard the Challenger.
And we'll also meet 14-year-old Peter Billingsley.
From computer data and other monitoring technology. Liftoff on what would be Challenger's last flight seemed picture perfect at yesterday's Cape Canaveral launch. But 65 seconds later, NASA ordered pilot Mike Smith to go to full power. And that's when the billion-dollar spaceship exploded, disintegrating with its crew of 7. Challenger's fiery end plunged the nation into mourning. Sheila Cast reports.
From the Oval Office, President Reagan faced the cameras to extend the nation's sympathy to the families of the shuttle's crew.
We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers, but overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. We mourn 7 heroes.
The mourning included lowering the flags to half-mast and dispatching Vice President Bush to Cape Canaveral to share the president's concern with the families of the crew. The president, in his televised message, reaffirmed his confidence in the U.S. space program.
We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue.
Some question whether the shuttle should still draw civilians, or even whether it should continue. The president made it clear that as that debate unfolds, he'll be a big booster for the shuttle program. Sheila Cast, ABC News, the White House.
Challenger's crew represented a cross-section of veterans and first-timers. Commander Dick Scobie of Washington State on his 2nd shuttle mission. Second in command, pilot Mike Smith of North Carolina on a 1st mission. The mission specialists, Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Ellison Onizuka, the first Hawaiian astronaut. Judy Resnick of Ohio, the 2nd American woman astronaut in space on her 2nd flight. And Ronald McNair of South Carolina, also a 2nd-timer. Gregory Jarvis, a civilian technician from California. And of course, Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher from New Hampshire. An investigation team begins meeting at the Space Center outside Houston today to try to unravel the mystery of the Challenger disaster. As Chris Bury reports, the tragedy stunned the close-knit community outside Houston that serves the Space Center.
The flags flew at half-staff as the mood sunk at NASA's Johnson Space Center near Houston. NASA employees shook their heads in disbelief and wiped away tears as they watched the bad news on TV.
I think everybody was just stunned and shocked and really can't comment on it too much. We've been asked not to.
While NASA imposed a news blackout, the nearby community of Clear Lake went into mourning. It's a company town where nearly everyone either works at NASA or knows someone who does.
You know, we're also proud of what they have done in this area. When something like this happens, it just sort of like a community wake.
And this kind of tragedy is, I think, going to devastate this community.
Amid all the sorrow here, there is also a great concern about the future, about what will happen to the 15 shuttle missions that had been planned this year.
I hope this doesn't hurt the space program. I don't think it should. I think that we should keep going, and I think that we should have a positive attitude.
But for now, the immediate task here is to recover from the personal loss in this company town, more intimately connected with the space program than any other. Chris Bury, ABC News at the Johnson Space Center near Houston.
And that's our latest news. David?
Steve, thank you. And it's almost 25 minutes before 8. Dave Murray's weather right after this.
New Hampshire. Mark Beauvais, the superintendent of schools for Concord, was at the launch yesterday along with a group of third-grade students, Scott McAuliffe's class, in fact. And Mark Beauvais joins us this morning from Krista McAuliffe's classroom at Concord High School, along with David Koyman and his 11-year-old daughter, Meredith. Mr. Koyman was mayor of Concord when Krista McAuliffe was chosen for the Space Shuttle program, and we welcome you all this morning.
Thank you.
Mr. Beauvais, you were there with, I think, 18 members of Scott's class, third-grade class there at the launch. At what point did the children realize that something was wrong, and how did they react?
At the point on the microphone system that the NASA official indicated that there was an explosion. That, however, was a point after which NASA people had started emptying the stands and asking people to please return to their buses. So the students heard the word explosion. They got onto their bus. In the meantime, some people were crying, adults that is, not students, and that did affect the students. Some of the students started to cry. I'd say no more than 3, however, burst out in tears or started to cry. Those students then proceeded onto their bus. They talked. Some of the students had their own parents with them. The school principal was there, teacher was there, etc. My family and I got on the bus and we sat with students. We didn't know at that time, however, and I think it's important for your viewers to remember that those of us who were there did not really know what happened. We did not understand what happened. We couldn't say to the children, Mrs. McAuliffe was killed. We didn't know that. We didn't know if the orbiter blew free and would parachute down. We didn't know. At that point in time, until some 3 hours later, we didn't know what happened.
And of course, there were many, many students all over the country, certainly back at your school there, that were also watching on televisions. What is being done now within the school system there at Concord in order to deal with the problem, Mr. Beauvais?
We're using our own staff of psychologists and counselors. However, this community has an outpouring of volunteers who have indicating a willingness to serve any of the needs the students have. That started yesterday and will continue until it is no longer necessary.
Mr. Koyman, you really got to see up close the amount of publicity and celebrity that came along with being chosen the first teacher to go into space. How did Krista react to all of that and deal with all of that?
I've often said that Krista, the community, she was selected as a teacher in space, but Krista was looked on as a representative of a goodwill ambassador for the Concord community. Krista seemed to emerge after her selection as a person who seemed destined for that role. And I think, I've said it before, that the community, to the extent that a community can, we all fell in love with Krista after her selection. I think her vitality and her perspective and her spunk just won us all over, and we became one with her. She was very much a representative of our community, and she seemed to embody all those things that we think about our community as being in a positive vein. I think for that reason, the realization now that the loss of Krista is beginning to hit the community very hard.
And in fact, the whole nation fell in love with Krista. I know you have your 10-year-old daughter there, Meredith.
Yes.
Meredith, you were also watching with your class on television the launch. After you saw it, after you had some time to think about it, what did you do?
Well, at first I was sad, and I didn't really know what to think, and I wasn't really sure if it was really true that it had blown up. And I was really sad because I had saw her in person and gotten her autograph.
And you also then sat down and you wrote a poem. Would you read that for us?
Yep. She died the first try, nobody knows why. We are sorry for her, but the braveness is great. Her heart was full of joy, her mind determination, but now is known happy in heaven. You taught us so much, and you were loved. We long to shake your hand, but the chance is gone. We saw the explosion, we cried our tears. We thank her for her braveness and for getting our fears. Thank you for trying to reach for a star, even though you didn't catch one. We love you, Sharon Krista McAuliffe.
And thank you, Meredith, very much.
You're welcome.
And Mr. Beauvais and Mr. Koinman, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And we will be back. Stay with us.
It's 7:45 right now. We're going to talk now with two veterans of our space program. Deke Slayton, one of the original American astronauts. He later became of the Space Shuttle Test Flight Program. He joins us from the Johnson Space Center in Houston. Gene Cernan, he was the last man to walk on the moon. And he is with us from KTRK TV in Houston. Good morning, Gene. Good morning, Deke.
Morning, Dave. Good morning, David.
Good morning. Deke, when your good friends, Ed White, Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, died, how do close friends like that, how do you and others who are close to astronauts who die in that way, how do you go on? How do you go forward?
Well, David, those of us that are in the business been through that kind of experience a number of times. That just kind of goes with the turf. It's the price you pay for the ticket, I guess. And so what you'll hope is that you'll learn something constructive from it and apply it to the future and press on and are better for it. And I think that was the case in that particular accident. We came up with a number of new materials that are benefiting people in a whole lot of other areas now, airplane travel and so forth. And of course, we had a very successful lunar program from that point on. And I think it was, in a large extent, due to the rigor that got into the program after that particular accident. So let's hope the same equivalent thing comes out of this one.
Gene, with all the time we have spent talking about the safety and the precautions, and we look at the computerization, the technology, and how much care is taken, and then we see what happened yesterday with apparently no indication. We haven't seen any indication yet today that something was amiss ahead of time. How can it happen?
Well, David, you know, we've had a tremendous success record we've come accustomed to over the last 25 years, but I don't think there's any of us, including Deke over there, who hadn't thought when his time came that was possible. It's not the kind of thing you talk about at home with your family or friends or even with your colleagues. You train for those emergencies you can handle. You don't worry. You don't train to die. You don't plan on it. But it's something you've got to acknowledge that can happen, and you accept that and you press on. You asked Deke a minute ago, what do you do after a disaster? You learn from history. You can't change what happened yesterday, but certainly you learn from it and try and do a better job tomorrow.
Gene, what happens now? An investigation, the program is grounded for the time being. Major investigations will go forward. Let's go down the road a little bit and think, well, what happens if they don't absolutely figure out what happened, why exactly it happened? What happens? Do you then say, well, we've got to go forward anyway? How do they do it?
Well, you know, I'm sure the answers will not come easy or quick. We look for quick success in this country of ours, particularly in a program like this, and we look for quick answers. We've been looking at them from the moment it happened yesterday. I don't believe those answers are going to come very quick. The easy way out would be to find a nut or a bolt or something that broke, know that was it, fix it, and press on and be on our way in a month or two. It probably won't happen that way. We may have to fix a lot of things, sort of witch hunt, if you will, shotgun, as Deke said yesterday, the problem, and fix a lot of things we think may have been the problem. hoping indeed that one of them was, and yet then press on when we know we've got a sure and a safe vehicle in which a problem like this not only will not but cannot happen again.
Deke, we keep hearing about the controversy or the debate about manned versus unmanned space programs. How concerned are you, as somebody who's spent much of your adult life involved with the manned flying programs of one kind or another, that this might throw more focus on the unmanned and take focus away from the manned program?
Well, most of the rhetoric I've heard on that subject, I think, is ill-founded to begin with. All programs are manned programs. The only difference is how close are you to the source of the data. And the last Uranus flyby we saw was obviously controlled by man, and all the data was processed by man. So to me, it's a kind of a false argument. The only issue is, where do you do the job best? And they're complementary, they're supplementary, and I think in all future programs you look at them exactly that way. How do you best get the job done? And that's the way you do it. Man lends so much being on the scene in some cases, it's ridiculous to consider not having him there. On the other hand, there are cases where it doesn't make a lot of sense, and when it doesn't, don't use them.
Deke and Gene, thank you both for joining us this morning.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. We'll be back in a moment with Tom Wolf. Eight minutes of 8 right now. For 6 years, Tom Wolf interviewed astronauts and their families before he wrote his book, The Right Stuff. It was published in 1979, became a bestseller, and in 1983, of course, it became a movie. It gave us really our first intimate look at the lives of the people in the original space program. Our earlier astronauts also faced tragedy. The fire on the launch pad that killed Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee back in 1967 that we just talked about with Deke Slayton. And this morning, Tom Wolf is joining me. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning, David.
You're quoted as saying that after you wrote the book, "To this day, I'm not very interested in the exploration of space," unquote. What is it then? What was of such great interest in this to you?
Well, to me, the psychology of the pilot, and not just the psychology of the astronaut, but the psychology of, particularly of the fighter pilot, that became the thing that was most intriguing, and is most intriguing to me to this day. You know, these pilots, and all of our first astronauts were military pilots, are well aware of the dangers they're facing. Irene Carpenter, who was the wife of one of our Mercury astronauts, told me, said, "You didn't need the statistics." She said, "When you find out that by the age of 25 you've been to about 18 funerals of close friends and associates of your husband, and your schoolmates have maybe been to 1 or 2 of a grandmother, you know it's a dangerous field." And the Navy actually came up with some statistics that they compiled in the late 60s, over 4 years, in which they determined that a Navy pilot flying for 20 years would be a typical career, stood a 23% chance of dying in an accident. It doesn't count combat.
Right.
That wasn't combat death isn't considered accidental. Right. 56% chance of having to eject and come down by parachute to avoid dying. And the funerals make these statistics very clear. And so they arrived at a code, which I named The Right Stuff, but a code of dealing with this equation that they are confronting every day. And I think it becomes both a kind of superstition in which you say to yourself, the averages say this, but I'm not an average person, and a code of behavior.
Senator Garn this morning said that he went with Senator Glenn, I believe, and Vice President Bush down and met with the families of all the people who died yesterday, and that Mrs. Scobie, the wife of the commander, said the program must go forward. What's your reaction to hearing that?
Well, that is also typical of the kind of strength that the wives of military pilots must have. In the case of the first catastrophe in our program, when Grissom and White and Chaffee died, I interviewed one of the wives who was sent over to the home of Mrs. Chaffee after the news had just broken. I mean, it hadn't really broken on the airwaves, and there's a very strict protocol in the military about how to handle a death. And a wife no woman, in fact, it was very strict, should break the news to the widow. It had to come from a man of some authority, preferably a close colleague of the dead pilot. The wife, another wife was supposed to go over and give solace. So this particular wife went over to Mrs. Chafee's house. She stood around, and already Mrs. Chafee knew something was up. Finally, one of the other astronauts arrives. She at this time was putting some dog food into a pan. The astronaut came in and broke the news. She looked him in the eye and said, "Thank you very much." She finished what she was doing, and then faced the. It's a strict, tough life.
Tom Wolfe, thank you, and we'll be back.
Today.
Our thoughts and prayers are with the astronauts, their families, colleagues, friends, and students. And we'll be back in a moment. In Florida, the flag at half-mast. This, of course, the launch pad from which Challenger lifted off yesterday morning. And like the rest of the people in our country, in fact, people around the world are joining us as we spend this morning remembering 7 heroes: Francis Dick Scobie, Michael Smith, Judy Resnick, Gregory Jarvis, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, and the woman who would have been our first teacher in space, Christa McAuliffe. I'm David Hartman with Joan London, and we'll be talking some more this morning with our former astronaut, Gene Cernan. He'll be with us in just a few minutes.
And I suppose grief hits hardest at those who witness a tragedy firsthand, and we will meet some of those witnesses. And we will also go to Concord, New Hampshire, Christa McAuliffe's hometown, to see how people who knew her there are handling this very sad time for all of us.
First, minute after 8, Steve Bell down in Washington with all of the news. Hi, Steve.
Hi, David, Joan. Good morning, everyone. As one NASA engineer put it, Mission Control's tapes will be reviewed millisecond by millisecond. Several teams already have begun investigating what caused the horrifying explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger that killed all 7 crew members. Some of Challenger's debris has been recovered, and ships and planes are combing the Atlantic for still more clues. But the final determination is expected to depend primarily on that technical data now being analyzed in Houston. Al Dale looks back now at yesterday's launch and its tragic aftermath.
This was the 4th try for the 25th shuttle mission, but spirits were high as the 7 crew members, including schoolteacher Christa McAuliffe, went to the launch pad and prepared for liftoff. The countdown went smoothly.
We have main engine start, 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff.
Liftoff was picture perfect for the first minute. Family members, including the parents of the first teacher on a shuttle mission, looked skyward as Challenger soared towards space. Then the horror that would transform the day from one of joy and hope to one of despair.
Minute 15 seconds, velocity 2,900 feet per second, altitude.
The normally confident voice of Houston Control became noticeably affected.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.
It took a while for the reality to sink in. Faces told the story. Vice President Bush arrived at the Cape, accompanied by 2 senator astronauts.
The President and I and the entire nation join in mourning the 7 splendid men and women who now rest in God's arms.
As one of the people who's been here all day with some of the families that told us coming in a few moments ago when he was talking to the families earlier, several of them said to him, "Don't let this slow the program down."
And here you see this morning from the Cape, ships going out into the area where the shuttle went off yesterday, searching.
That report from correspondent Al Dale at Cape Canaveral this morning. 4 of the 7 crew members who died were on their second shuttle missions, among them spacecraft commander Dick Scobie. Mission Specialist Ronald McNair, the second black in space on his second mission. So was Mission Specialist Judith Resnick, the second woman in space. And aerospace engineer Ellison Onizuka had flown on the shuttle's first secret mission. He also the first Japanese American in space. Aeronautical engineer Michael Smith, the pilot, although on his first mission. Electrical engineer Gregory Jarvis on his first shuttle flight. And of course, best known, Christa McAuliffe, who was to have become the first teacher in space. As experts try to determine what went wrong, Lynn Scher reviews the now painfully familiar television tape for clues to the tragedy.
As Challenger climbed into the sky, it looked normal. Pretty as a picture, observers said, textbook perfect. And then, perhaps the first sign of disaster. An orange flame where the big fuel tank is connected to the shuttle and where its fuel lines feed into the three main engines. At the left, a plume indicating gases from the tank supply of liquid hydrogen and oxygen. More food for the fire. Within seconds, the flame jumps upward, the source of the catastrophic explosion. It is an immense fireball, igniting yet another explosion at the top of the external tank, and it consumes the shuttle. Then, for a moment, from out of the smoke, we appear to see the top of the shuttle Challenger emerging briefly. Our last view of the now ruined spacecraft before it falls to the sea with its very precious cargo. Finally, a view of one of the solid rocket boosters, still burning but on a cockeyed path, separated prematurely from the shuttle on its way to the ocean. That, at least, is what we can see from the tapes. But the pictures are just one of the tools NASA will use to try to determine the cause of the explosion. They'll also look at the data transmitted during the liftoff sequence. They'll examine the bits and pieces of material retrieved from the ocean. And they can only hope that all of those sources will, in fact, lead to the answer. How did it happen? Lynn Scher, ABC News, Los Angeles.
President Reagan called the death of the 7 crew members a national loss. And in Christa McAuliffe's hometown of Concord, New Hampshire, friends and relatives gathered last night to say goodbye. McAuliffe's student said her death had made them feel as if a part of them had died. This morning, Concord High School has canceled classes so that professional counselors can talk to students about their loss. John McKenzie standing by in Concord this morning. John?
Steve, I think it was difficult for any of us to watch what happened yesterday, to see the spacecraft and the 7 people on board blow apart. There are many questions to be answered, but among them, what impact the sight of that will have on the children who are watching it live on television, and in particular, the school children here at Concord High School. Christa McAuliffe taught here for 3 years, taught economics and history and law. She made the children here such an important part of her life. They were involved in virtually everything she did. She got into the space program in large part for them. She said she wanted to demystify space. And last night, Governor John Sununu said he hoped what would happen yesterday and the sight of it will not traumatize these students.
What about the help that they're going to get today? Just exactly what's being done?
Well, the classes are canceled here today, but the doors will remain open to allow the students and the teachers to continue to grieve together if they wish. They're also bringing in professional guidance counselors to talk to the students. They say it's important at this stage that the students feel free to articulate their fears, to ask questions, even though no one has any answers.
John McKenzie in Concord, thank you very much. Briefly now, other news this morning. Temperatures in Florida did not drop as much as feared yesterday, sparing citrus growers another deep freeze. Killer freezes, you'll recall, over the past 2 years have cost Florida growers $3 billion. And there's been another spy arrest in this country. Airman First Class Bruce Ott charged with trying to pass intelligence to the Soviet Union. Ott working at the aviation wing in California that operates super-secret SR-71 spy planes. And that's our news at 8. Joan?
Thank you, Stephen. Right now to 7 minutes after 8 and time for the weather. And Dave Murray, what's it look like?
Well, we've got another mixed bag today. We've got plenty of clouds as we look at the view from the weather satellite this morning. Clouds from 2 storm systems. One is starting to push into the west coast this morning, the other moving into the Ohio Valley. This is a small Alberta clipper that will quickly push to the east with gusty winds and a pocket of about 1 to 3 inch snow, though I think heavier snow is going to fall across eastern portions of New England during the night tonight. Out west, the storm is going to fizzle rather quickly as it comes up over the mountains, but a new Alberta clipper is going to pull together weather in the plains that's going to reinforce the cold and the snow for the northern plains. At the same time, most of the East Coast will clear out. That's a look at the national weather. Now here's what you can expect.
A headline in a New York newspaper this morning, in the New York Daily News, as a matter of fact. It said, and I'm quoting, the shuttle, quote, the shuttle looks like a lemon, unquote. What's your reaction to hearing that quote, or if you were to read the quote?
Well, I hadn't heard it until just this moment, but it's obviously very short-sighted. The triumph, the accomplishments that the shuttle has brought this nation and the people of it that are to a great degree yet unrealized, phenomenal. I don't know how anyone can print. I'm not even sure that that's newsworthy.
Gene, there seem to have been a lot of contradictory messages being sent by the media, by industry, by NASA, by everybody involved who participates in all this. On one hand, that, you know, the launches, it's become routine, we're used to the great success, to the fact that, you know, we were not even covering these anymore. On the other hand, the critics saying they can't keep on the schedule, you know, they can't seem to make this thing come up to expectations as they had hoped. How do you view all these messages coming at the public? What are they to make of all of this?
Well, unfortunately, I think a lot of people tend to use a situation like this as a platform to be heard, to air some of their own thoughts and considerations and some of their own, perhaps, special interest. The history of the shuttle program, the history of the entire space program has been very well thought out. It's been fraught with disaster to some degree, where we've lost lives in the past. You know, you pay as you go to generate a program that has brought this country and this nation, the world for that matter, as much as the development and exploration of space has. You've got to be willing to pay the price as you go. That's going to continue to be the case. The shuttle is not yet an airliner. Even airliners today have been flying for 50, 60, 70 years, do have their problems. What does the word routine mean? Does it mean we go up without concern or without cause? No, I don't think that'll ever be the case. Realistically,
Gene, when do you think another shuttle might fly? I know you don't know, nobody knows, but give us an idea.
Well, David, it's certainly safe to say I think it's going to be at least a full year, maybe as much as 2. This problem will be thought out very thoroughly. I know the manner in which NASA acts. I know the people that are back there. We'll put 3, 4, 5, 7 men again and again and again on a shuttle as we go into the turn of the century. We'll look back at this as a major milestone in allowing us to do that. You know, David, I've thought a lot about this and been able to reflect a great deal in the last 24 hours. And you and I have talked about it. We are a generation that has inherited space. We've inherited the opportunities and the challenges that go with it. And we must be willing to pay the price for those opportunities. We have in the past, and I happen to firmly believe that this nation is ready and has enough resolve to do so in the future.
As sad as it is.
As sad as it might be.
Gene, thank you. And we'll be back in just a moment, 12 after.
It is now 14 minutes after, and with us now in Concord, New Hampshire is Marilyn Monahan, an eyewitness to yesterday's space shuttle tragedy. She watched the launch from the same bleachers at Cape Canaveral that held the friends and families of the astronauts. Marilyn is a 6th grade teacher from Manchester, New Hampshire, and president of the state chapter of the National Education Association, the NEA. And good morning, Marilyn.
Good morning, Joan.
You were standing with who there at the launch?
I was standing with a number of teachers that were down from New Hampshire, right next to all of the teachers that were the finalists throughout the country. To my right and to the left were the 3rd grade students that were down to witness this launch.
And those were the students from Scott McAuliffe's 3rd grade class, I know.
That's correct.
What did you see and what did you hear?
Well, we positioned ourselves very carefully so that we could see both the countdown board and also the launch, the rocket itself off to the left. And we were excited when the launch down count went below 9, since that's what it had been held at for so long. And there were cheers to our right as we screamed, give me a C, give me an H, give me an R, and we spelled Krista and yelled for teachers. And then suddenly the countdown kept going, and it was finally at 0, and we had a liftoff. And there's just incredible excitement to see that liftoff. The Challenger veered to the right, and a great cloud of white smoke just enveloped the area. It was white trail of smoke from the earth right to the heavens. And then suddenly the second happening where the two rockets were to disengage from the Challenger occurred. They went off to either side, and suddenly we heard that there was a major malfunction and a silence fell over, or there were screams. And then they announced that there had been an explosion, and stunned silence and disbelief just engulfed all of us.
I know that Krista's parents, the Corrigans, were also there in that area. Did you look for them?
I did, because I had just been speaking to them about 15 minutes before the countdown resumed, and I saw where they were and had been talking with them, as I said before, and they're just such warm couple that you felt you had known them all your life. And so I looked for them, and I looked for the children in just hopes to make sure everyone was in some way attempting to grapple with this.
What message do you think that the teachers who were there yesterday with you will be taking back into their classrooms today to help the children deal, and just the message about the space program?
Well, undoubtedly there was sorrow in every classroom in America yesterday, and certainly in the homes of all the teachers across this land. And I think they will be there today, as they were yesterday, trying to help the youngsters understand that sometimes in the midst of a beautiful dream we have to deal with horrible nightmares. And they'll talk to them with it, and they'll give them hope, and they'll bring the message of Krista of Reach for the Stars that she signed so often in autographs in this state. And I think they'll work with the youngsters in whatever way they can to help them try to understand this, although even to adults it seems almost incomprehensible.
And I know you're standing there in front of the school this morning where all of that is going to be going on, and where counselors are being brought in to help the children deal with their grief and their shock. We thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
And right now, Jane Close Connolly is with us. She is a professor of educational psychology at the University of Nebraska. She is familiar with how children and adults respond to grief, and she's here to tell us what we might expect from our children and even ourselves, really, as we come to terms with the tragedy of the Challenger. And it's nice to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
So many children across the country really got involved in this. Many of them have been studying all about space and about the shuttle for months now, and many of them watched that liftoff. What might be the typical responses that we as parents should expect, and even from different age groups?
I think that the different age groups is an important thing to keep in mind. This situation, the children are closer to it than many other tragedies. The teachers there, many were watching. Young children especially experience death as fear. Can it happen to me? They don't have that line between what's out there and what's next to them. So we might see young children who are particularly sensitive to it for whatever reason, stomach aches, nightmares, might want to sit closer to mom and dad, get up at night, make sure they're there. As they get a little older, I think we see other things in children, and I noticed with Mrs. McAuliffe's high school class, I think they're, especially with adolescents, they're struggling themselves with the meaning of life, and I saw their faces on the tape, and I think they think a lot about death, and the question is life meaningful? What is this? How do I make sense of it? So I would see them really reflecting a lot and being very troubled.
Might a parent with a very small child, 1 through 3 grades, even see a totally opposite reaction and not see grief?
Absolutely. I've already heard from my home and calling my children that children, in dealing with the anxiety they feel, and they don't understand death, so they do feel anxious about it, may say real dumb, obnoxious, mean things. Oh, that was funny to see it blow up, or oh, I'm glad a teacher got killed. And
so parents should understand where that's coming from and realize that there's anxiety. And
yeah, it's not something to punish a child about. It's something to say, that's not what I would say about that. I would say something different, and give them a model of how to talk about it.
All right, in President Reagan's speech to the nation yesterday, he had some very specific things to say to children, and here's a bit of what he said.
I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave.
What might we as parents say to our children to help?
I think in keeping with the spirit of Mrs. McCullough, we should see this as a teachable moment for children and bring it up and say...
Do bring it up.
Do bring it up and bring it up in the context of, to my child, I would say, I was really upset by this. This is so sad to see this happen. Give them a forum, give them a possibility to talk about their feelings, not to suggest it, and not be upset if they don't respond to us, but to talk about it, to make the crisis a time where a family can discuss what is a really important part of life and is real mysterious, though, for children.
Parents have probably heard this before, but we'll say it again. You should never equate death to going to sleep.
That's right.
Is that correct?
That's right, yeah. And if they have another belief system, if they can talk about death in the context of their religion, that's very comforting for a child. If they can, I think they should be aware what children want are concrete examples about, are they still safe? Is mom still safe? Is dad still safe? And so if mom can say, I take, I don't go out at night and I buckle up the seatbelt and I do concrete things to keep myself safe, and here's what I do to keep you safe. Children worry about sometimes the small aspects of death because that's what they can understand, and when we're talking about up to 3rd grade.
And teachers are being advised to also bring it up in class today and talk about it?
I think that's a real good thing. Now, not every teacher will be as comfortable, but most schools have school psychologists available to them and counselors. And if a teacher's not comfortable, to go in and talk it over with those people and get herself or get himself comfortable with it and bring it up. The most typical adult reaction to death is to hide it from children, and that can make it even scarier.
All right, thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome.
We'll be back in just a moment. Stay with us.